A healthy 34-year-old woman walked into the emergency room because something kept moving inside her eye. At first, doctors thought she was imagining it. Then they looked closer. What they found wasn't dust, it wasn't an infection, and it wasn't a tumor. There was something alive inside her eye. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. Because the scan revealed she wasn't infected in just one place. Tiny parasites had already spread throughout her body, including dangerously close to her brain. Just weeks earlier, she'd done something millions of people around the world have done without thinking twice. During an ordinary meal, she ate raw pork. How could one meal turn into a parasite that traveled through her body and nearly stole her sight? And why did the first symptoms appear so late that by the time doctors discovered the truth, the damage had already begun here? This is the true medical mystery behind one of the most disturbing parasitic infections doctors have ever documented. And it all started with a meal almost anyone could have eaten. This is hidden pathogens.
This is hidden pathogens?
The woman sitting in that examination room was Melissa. She was 34 years old, a graphic designer from Southern California, and the kind of person who depended on her eyesight every single day. Deadlines, client presentations, photo editing, her eyes were her career. Just 2 weeks earlier, she had been completely healthy, or so she thought. By the time she walked into the emergency room, something had already been living inside her body for weeks. She just didn't know it yet. As an ophthalmologist adjusted the bright slit lamp and leaned closer, Melissa swallowed hard. "I know this sounds impossible," she said quietly, "but something keeps moving inside my eye." The doctor didn't answer. He simply looked closer. Melissa hadn't rushed to the hospital because she was in unbearable pain. She came because she could no longer convince herself that what she was seeing wasn't real. It had begun with an occasional blur drifting across the corner of her right eye. Sometimes it looked like a tiny floating thread. Other times it disappeared the moment she tried to focus on it. She blamed long hours at work. Friends told her it was probably eye strain. An urgent care clinic diagnosed dry eyes and allergies, handed her lubricating drops, and sent her home. For a few days, she wanted to believe they were right. Then, one morning while applying mascara, she froze. Something beneath the white of her eye slowly slid from one side, then vanished. She jerked backward from the mirror. Her heart started racing. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, looked again. Nothing. She almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. But over the next several days, it happened again and again, always for only a second, always disappearing before anyone else could see it. The movement wasn't painful. It wasn't itchy. It wasn't even constant. That was what made it so terrifying. It felt as though something alive was quietly changing position every time she moved her eyes. By the time she arrived at the emergency room, she wasn't asking for eye drops anymore. She was asking one question: what is inside my eye? The ophthalmologist remained silent. He slowly pushed his chair back, stepped into the hallway, and called for another specialist. A few moments later, both doctors were staring into Melissa's eye without saying a word. One of them finally broke the silence. "We need imaging immediately." What had they just seen that turned a routine eye examination into a medical emergency? Within minutes, Melissa was no longer just another patient in the emergency department. She had become a medical mystery. An ophthalmologist called in a retinal specialist. The retinal specialist called in another colleague. Soon, 3 doctors were gathered around a single slit lamp, taking turns examining her right eye. No one explained what they were seeing. They adjusted the microscope, measured, looked again, then quietly stepped aside for the next doctor. Melissa's pulse quickened. Doctors usually talked. They reassured patients. Not today. Finally, the retinal specialist pulled his chair closer. "Melissa, I need to ask you a few questions." She nodded. "Have you traveled outside the United States recently?" "No." Have you been swimming in lakes, rivers, or untreated water? No. Any recent eye injury, even something minor? No. Wear contact lenses? Never. Any recent illness? Fever? Stomach problems? Melissa paused. No. The doctor wrote something down. Every answer ruled out another possibility. Yet none of them explained what he was seeing. He leaned back into the microscope one final time. The room fell completely still. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Then the specialist slowly looked up at the others. I saw it again. Another doctor immediately took his place at the microscope. He watched the same tiny translucent structure beneath the surface of Melissa's eye. 5 seconds, 10. Then his expression changed. It moved. Not much. Just enough. Enough to prove it wasn't a reflection. It wasn't a blood clot, and it wasn't a piece of damaged tissue. Melissa felt her stomach tighten. What moved? No one answered. Instead, the retinal specialist reached for the phone. I need radiology, he said. CT and MRI, head and orbits. As soon as possible. The nurse looked surprised. Both? Both. Within minutes, Melissa was being wheeled through the hospital corridors toward the imaging department. She had walked into the emergency room expecting someone to prescribe eye drops. Instead, doctors were trying to determine whether whatever was inside her eye had reached somewhere even more dangerous. As the MRI table slowly carried her into the scanner, Melissa stared into the narrow tunnel above her. She still didn't know what the doctors had seen. She only knew one thing. Whatever had moved inside her eye was alive. Here is what happened inside Melissa's body while she believed nothing had gone wrong. The raw pork looked perfectly safe. It smelled fresh. It tasted exactly the way it should. Melissa finished every bite. She walked out of the restaurant feeling completely normal, but something microscopic had entered her body. She couldn't taste it. She couldn't smell it. She couldn't feel it. Inside her stomach, it survived. Minutes later, it reached her small intestine. That was where its real journey began. It attached itself quietly. Hidden deep within the folds of her intestine, it continued its life cycle without causing enough damage to attract attention. Melissa never felt it. She went to work the next morning. She answered emails. She laughed with coworkers. She called her mother that evening and told her the pork had been worth trying. Nothing about her life suggested that anything was wrong. Then, without warning, the infection entered a new phase. Microscopic forms, each smaller than a grain of sand, began crossing the wall of her intestine. One by one, they slipped into her bloodstream. Her heart carried them through her body with every beat. Most were destroyed before they could go any farther, but a few escaped. Not because they were stronger, because they were almost invisible. One drifted into the delicate tissues behind Melissa's right eye. There, it stopped. It didn't attack. It didn't spread, it hid. Around itself, it formed a thin, fluid-filled capsule, a shelter no larger than a pea. Inside that shelter, it remained alive. The tiny capsule did something extraordinary. Instead of provoking an immediate immune attack, it quieted the cells around it just enough to avoid detection. The danger wasn't what the organism was doing. The danger was what Melissa's body wasn't doing. It wasn't sounding the alarm. Days became weeks. Weeks became more weeks. The capsule grew so slowly that Melissa noticed nothing at all. She celebrated a friend's birthday. She planned a weekend trip. She paid bills. She complained about traffic. She lived every ordinary moment believing she was perfectly healthy. Then one morning, while reading an email, something drifted across the corner of her vision. She blinked. It disappeared. A few seconds later, it came back. Melissa rubbed her eye and went back to work. She had no idea she had just noticed the first visible sign of an infection that had been growing silently inside her body for weeks. And by then, it was no longer confined to one place. Melissa had never been inside an MRI machine before. As the table carried her into the narrow tunnel, The machine began its relentless rhythm. Bang, bang, bang. She closed her eyes. Every sound seemed louder than the last. She wasn't thinking about the scan. She was thinking about the two retinal specialists. Neither of them had argued about what they saw. Neither of them had questioned whether it was real. They had only asked one another one question. Did it move? Nearly an hour later, the scan was over. A technician helped Melissa back into a wheelchair and wheeled her into a curtained room in the emergency department. Then, nothing. 10 minutes passed, then 30, then 60. Every time footsteps stopped outside her curtain, Melissa looked up. Every time, they continued down the hallway. Finally, the curtain opened. The emergency physician stepped inside. He wasn't alone. A neurologist followed behind him. Melissa felt her stomach tighten. She had come to the hospital because of one eye. Now a brain specialist was standing at her bedside. The neurologist introduced himself and sat down. "I'd like to ask you a few questions." Melissa answered each one carefully. No seizures, no memory loss, no weakness, no numbness, no trouble speaking. The neurologist nodded after every answer. Then he turned toward the computer. Melissa watched him open the MRI. Slice after slice appeared on the screen. The room became silent. He scrolled once, stopped, zoomed in, then called the emergency physician closer. Neither doctor spoke. They simply stared at the same image. Melissa couldn't read an MRI, but she could read their faces. Whatever they were looking at, they hadn't expected to find it. The neurologist continued scrolling. Another image, then another. He measured something, looked again, measured it a second time. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "The scan answered one important question," he said quietly. Melissa waited, but it raised several others. "What does that mean?" "It means the problem in your eye," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "may not be the only thing we need to investigate." Melissa felt the air leave her lungs. The emergency physician stepped out to make a phone call. A few moments later, a nurse returned carrying an identification bracelet. Melissa looked down as it was fastened around her wrist. Neurology admission. She wasn't going home. Not tonight. The MRI hadn't given the doctors an answer. It had convinced them the mystery was bigger than anyone had imagined. If the scan showed the problem wasn't confined to Melissa's eye, what else had the doctors just discovered hiding inside her body? Melissa barely slept. Every few hours, someone entered her room. A flashlight shined into her eyes. A nurse asked the same questions. "What is your name? Do you know where you are? Can you lift both arms?" Every answer was normal. Every examination ended the same way. Someone left the room looking more concerned than when they entered. By morning, Melissa had been seen by an ophthalmologist, a neurologist, a neuroradiologist. No one seemed willing to tell her what they were thinking. Late that afternoon, the neurologist returned carrying a folder of MRI images. He placed them on the lightboard beside her bed. Melissa studied the glowing circles and shadows. They meant nothing to her. The neurologist pointed to several small, round abnormalities. "We've reviewed your scan with multiple specialists." He paused. "The leading possibility is that these represent a serious disease affecting the brain." Melissa felt her throat tighten. "What kind of disease?" The room fell silent. Finally, the neurologist answered, "One possibility is that we're looking at multiple tumors." Melissa stopped breathing. Her mother covered her mouth. Her father stared at the floor. No one spoke. The word hung in the room long after the neurologist finished talking. Tumors. Only 2 days earlier, Melissa thought she needed stronger glasses. Now doctors were discussing whether she had multiple tumors in her brain. Additional blood tests were ordered. More imaging followed. By evening, another team reviewed every scan from the beginning. The abnormalities were real. No one questioned that anymore. But as more specialists studied the images, a quiet disagreement began to emerge. Something wasn't right. The spots looked too similar, too evenly defined, too deliberate. One radiologist measured them twice. Another compared them with the eye images. A third simply frowned and kept scrolling. Melissa couldn't understand the scans, but she understood silence. Doctors become quiet when they're thinking. Doctors become quieter when something doesn't make sense. That night, Melissa overheard a conversation outside her room. "I know what it looks like," one physician said, "but it doesn't behave like it." There was another long silence. Then someone else spoke. "We need another opinion." No one said from whom. No one explained why. Melissa lay awake staring at the ceiling. For the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't afraid of the answer. She was afraid that no one had the right one. What was the one question the next doctor would ask that every other specialist had completely overlooked? Before we continue, if you're fascinated by real medical mysteries like this, share this video and subscribe to this channel. And if you value these videos, let me know where you are watching from and your age in the comments ganaj. Now, let's continue. The next morning, Melissa was awakened before sunrise. A different physician stood outside her room, quietly reading through her chart. He wasn't part of the team that had admitted her. He hadn't examined her eye. He hadn't reviewed her case the day before. Sometimes, a fresh set of eyes notices what everyone else has learned to overlook. He walked into the room and introduced himself. Then he did something none of the other doctors had done. He closed the MRI, he turned away from the eye photographs, and he looked directly at Melissa. "I'd like to start over," he said. Melissa nodded. He didn't ask about the shadow drifting across her vision. He didn't ask about headaches. He didn't ask about the strange findings on the MRI. Instead, he asked a question that seemed completely unrelated. "Tell me everything you remember eating during the month before this started." Melissa frowned. "My diet? Everything." She hesitated. There had been takeout, family dinners, coffee on the way to work. Nothing seemed important. "I don't think I ate anything unusual." The physician didn't write anything. He simply waited. Silence has a way of pulling memories to the surface. Melissa searched further back. Then her expression changed. There was one dinner. The physician looked up. "My friends talked me into trying raw pork." No one in the room spoke. The doctor didn't react. He didn't look surprised. He simply asked another question. "Was anyone else at the table willing to try it?" Melissa shook her head. "No, just me." Another note. Another long silence. Then came one final question. "Did your symptoms begin before that meal or after it?" Melissa answered without hesitation. "After." The physician closed the chart. For several seconds, he stared at the MRI without saying a word. Then he slowly opened the photographs of Melissa's eye. He compared them side by side, again and again. Finally, he stood. The neurologist looked at him expectantly. "Do you see something?" he asked. The physician nodded once. "I see a detail we've all been looking past." He pointed toward the images. "It explains something none of our other theories can." "What is it?" The physician didn't answer. "Not yet." Instead, he turned back toward Melissa. "I'd like to order a few additional tests." The neurologist folded his arms. "You don't think we're dealing with tumors anymore?" The physician was quiet for a moment. Then he gave the only answer he was willing to give. "I think we've been asking the wrong questions." No one spoke. Within the hour, new laboratory tests were ordered. The pathology team was called. The radiologist reviewed every scan for a third time. Nothing about Melissa had changed, but the direction of the entire investigation had. As the doctors left the room, Melissa watched them through the half-open door. For the first time since she arrived at the hospital, they weren't trying to prove a diagnosis. They were trying to disprove one. What single detail had every specialist overlooked that made one doctor abandon the leading diagnosis completely? The additional blood tests came back the next morning. The scans were reviewed again, not by looking for tumors, but by looking for a pattern. The physician returned to Melissa's room, carrying the results. He pulled up a chair beside her bed. For the first time since she had entered the hospital, someone finally had an answer. The doctor looked at Melissa and her parents. Here is what happened. Several weeks earlier, Melissa had eaten raw pork. Inside that meat was the immature stage of a parasite. It wasn't capable of reaching her eye. It wasn't capable of reaching her brain. Not yet. Instead, it quietly matured inside her intestine. Melissa never felt it. She never became sick. She had no reason to think anything was wrong. Weeks passed. Then the parasite began producing microscopic eggs, millions of them, invisible to the naked eye. During everyday life, some of those eggs found their way back into Melissa's mouth. She never noticed. No unusual taste, no unusual smell, nothing to warn her. That was the moment everything changed. Inside her stomach, the eggs hatched. Tiny larvae emerged, each one smaller than a grain of sand. They burrowed through the wall of her small intestine and entered her bloodstream. Her heart pumped them through her body. Most never survived. Some settled in muscle. Some disappeared without ever causing symptoms. But a few reached places they should never have reached. One entered the tissues of her eye. Others traveled into her brain. There, each larva built a tiny fluid-filled cyst around itself. Then they did something extraordinary. They released chemicals that silenced the immune system around them. Melissa's own body couldn't see them, so it never attacked them. For weeks, they remained hidden. Melissa went to work, met friends, made plans, laughed, completely unaware that living cysts were quietly growing inside two of the most delicate organs in her body. Then one of the cysts inside her eye shifted position. Not because the parasite was searching for somewhere to go, but because living tissue is constantly moving. That tiny movement cast a shadow across her retina. The drifting spot she thought was a harmless floater was the first visible sign of a much larger problem. The doctor paused. Then, for the first time, he gave it a name. The parasite responsible is called the pork tapeworm. Its scientific name is Taenia solium. When its larvae form cysts inside the eye, the condition is called ocular cysticercosis. The spots we found in your brain were caused by the very same process. Melissa looked back at her MRI. Every bright spot, at every frightening theory, every sleepless night, they had all started with a single meal she barely remembered eating. Then the doctor's expression changed. The diagnosis explains what is happening. He paused. It doesn't solve our biggest problem. Melissa felt her stomach tighten. If you know what it is, why can't you just remove it? The doctor didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked back at the MRI. Sometimes, knowing the enemy is only the beginning. Why could killing the parasites too quickly become even more dangerous than leaving them alive? Finding the diagnosis should have brought relief. Instead, it created a new nightmare. The additional scans confirmed what the doctors feared. The cyst inside Melissa's eye was still alive. So were several of the cysts inside her brain. The physician gathered Melissa and her parents in a quiet consultation room. For the first time since this began, no one had to guess what they were fighting. Melissa leaned forward. So when do we start treatment? No one answered. The doctor looked down at the MRI before finally speaking. There is a medication that can kill the parasites. Melissa smiled for the first time in days. It disappeared almost immediately. But killing them, the doctor said quietly, is the most dangerous part. He enlarged one of the bright spots on the MRI. Right now, each parasite is hiding inside a fluid-filled cyst. As long as it remains alive, it releases substances that dampen the immune response around it. Your body barely notices it's there. He changed to the next image. When the medication kills the parasites, that protection disappears. For the first time, your immune system recognizes them, and it attacks. Melissa nodded. That's what we want, isn't it? Yes. He paused. But your immune system doesn't attack only the parasite. It attacks the surrounding brain tissue as well. He pointed to the scan. One cyst may cause swelling. He pointed to another. Melissa has several. The room fell silent. If they all trigger inflammation at the same time. He let the sentence hang. The pressure inside the skull can rise rapidly. Patients can suffer seizures. They can lose consciousness. In the most severe cases, he stopped. The swelling itself can become fatal. Melissa's father stared at the MRI. So the medicine that saves her could also kill her. The doctor nodded once. That's why we can't rush. The specialists met that afternoon. Neurology, ophthalmology, infectious disease. Every one of them agreed Melissa needed treatment. None of them agreed on the safest way to begin it. Some believed they should reduce the inflammation first. Others argued that every day the parasites remained alive increased the risk of more damage to her eye. For nearly 2 hours, they debated. Not because they didn't know the disease, because they knew it too well. Melissa sat alone in her hospital room, staring at the drifting shadow that still crossed her vision. For days, she had prayed for a diagnosis. Now she had one. What she didn't have was a safe solution. Which would reach Melissa first? The parasites, or the treatment meant to destroy them? First, they needed to prepare Melissa's body for what was about to happen. She was started on high-dose corticosteroids to calm the inflammation her immune system was expected to unleash. Every day, doctors examined her eyes. Every day, neurologists checked for signs of seizures, confusion, or weakness. Only after several days did they begin the anti-parasitic medication. The first 24 hours passed quietly. Melissa allowed herself to believe the worst was over. It wasn't. On the second day of treatment, she woke with the worst headache of her life. The drifting shadow in her right eye became darker. Brighter lights made the pain unbearable. Within minutes, nurses were rushing her for another brain scan. The MRI showed exactly what the doctors had feared. Some of the cysts were dying. Around them, the surrounding brain tissue had begun to swell. The medication was working, and that was the problem. The steroids were increased. Her neurological examinations became almost hourly. Every small change mattered. Could she squeeze both hands? Could she follow a finger with her eyes? Could she remember today's date? Melissa began measuring time one examination at a time. Not by mornings, not by nights. By every moment, the doctors said, everything is still stable. Days turned into a week. The headache slowly eased. No seizures came. The swelling stopped getting worse. Then the ophthalmologist performed another detailed examination of her eye. The cyst that had been drifting across her vision was no longer moving. It had collapsed. The parasite was dead, but its disappearance did not restore what it had damaged. Scar tissue had already formed inside the delicate structures of her eye. Some of the vision she had lost would never return. When the doctor explained that, Melissa didn't cry. She covered her right eye. Then her left. Then her right again. She already knew. The world would never look quite the same. Weeks later, she walked out of the hospital beside her parents. Alive. The parasites had been defeated. But victory had come with a permanent reminder she would see every morning for the rest of her life. After surviving the infection and the treatment, how much of Melissa's life could she ever truly get back? 3 months later, Melissa returned to the same hospital, not because the infection had come back, because the doctors needed to know what it had left behind. The MRI looked different now. Most of the cysts had collapsed. The swelling inside her brain had almost completely resolved. There were no new lesions. The treatment had worked. But healing is not the same as restoration. The ophthalmologist dimmed the lights and examined the back of Melissa's eye one more time. The parasite was gone. In its place was a small patch of scar tissue. Permanent. It would never move again. Neither would the blind spot it had left behind. Melissa had learned to live with it. Her brain had begun doing what the human brain does remarkably well, adapting. She turned her head slightly when reading. She instinctively shifted her gaze while driving. She no longer reached for objects exactly where she first saw them. Without realizing it, She had taught herself a new way to see the world. Her follow-up appointments became less frequent. Every month became every 3 months, then every 6. Each visit ended with the same quiet relief. No new cysts. Her neurologist smiled for the first time since they had met. "I think we've won." Melissa smiled back. "I don't think anyone wins this." The doctor didn't disagree. She returned to work, met friends for dinner, started exercising again. From the outside, her life looked almost exactly the way it had before. Most people never knew what had happened. They couldn't see the blind spot. They couldn't see the fear that returned every time she noticed a new floater in her vision. Or every time a headache lasted a little longer than usual. Some injuries disappear from scans long before they disappear from memory. Months after leaving the hospital, Melissa met the physician who had asked the question that changed everything. She thanked him. He shook his head. "I didn't save you." He looked toward the hallway where patients were still waiting to be seen. "I just asked the question everyone else forgot to ask." Melissa thought about that all the way home. One meal, one overlooked detail, one question that had been the difference between losing her sight and losing far more. If Melissa survived because one doctor asked the right question, how many other patients never get that chance? Melissa still enjoys eating out. She still meets friends for dinner. She still tries new restaurants. But there is one thing she never orders anymore: raw pork. Not because every serving will make someone sick, and not because every restaurant is unsafe, but because she knows something she didn't know before. Sometimes, the most dangerous part of an illness isn't the infection. It's everything that happens after it. The weeks when you feel perfectly healthy. The symptoms that seem too small to matter. The diagnosis no one thinks to consider. And the ordinary decision that quietly changes the rest of your life. The parasite that infected Melissa belongs to a species called Taenia Solium. Around the world, it continues to infect thousands of people every year. Most will never imagine that a disease capable of reaching the brain or the eye could begin with something as ordinary as a meal. The danger isn't panic. The danger is not knowing. Melissa was fortunate. One physician stopped looking only at scans. He looked at her story. He asked about what she had eaten. That single question changed everything. Today, Melissa still has a small blind spot in her right eye. Most people would never notice it. She notices it every single day. It reminds her that surviving a disease and escaping it are not always the same thing. A few months ago, she met friends at another restaurant. When the server asked whether anyone wanted to try the chef's raw pork specialty, everyone looked at Melissa. She smiled politely. "I'll have mine fully cooked." No one at the table understood why that answer came so quickly. She never explained. She didn't need to. Some lessons stay with you long after the scars stop showing. If you ever develop unexplained changes in your vision, persistent headaches, seizures, or unusual neurological symptoms, especially after travel or eating undercooked pork, tell your doctor everything. Not just how you feel. Tell them where you've been. Tell them what you've eaten. Sometimes, the smallest detail becomes the one that saves your eyesight, or even your life. One meal. One overlooked clue, one doctor who asked the right question. That was the only difference. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. These stories take a lot of research to put together. If you'd like to support the channel, you'll find a free link in the description and pinned comment. Checking it out helps support future videos, and every click allows us to keep bringing these cases to the channel. Also, it's completely free. If you learned something from this case, like, share, and subscribe for more real medical stories. And if you chose not to subscribe, leave a comment and tell me what would make these videos better. I read far more comments than you might think. This is Hidden Pathogens. I'll see you in the next diagnosis. Good night.
This is Hidden Pathogens.